I'm Iain Dale. On the panel with me tonight, to my left, Gina Miller, entrepreneur and transparency campaigner, who's the leader of the True and Fair Party. We'll find out a little bit more about that during the course of the programme. To her left, Richard Holden, Conservative Roads Minister and MP for North West Durham. To my right, Kate Mansey, Assistant Editor and Royal Reporter at the Mail on Sunday. And to her right, Stephen Morgan, Labour Shadow Schools Minister and MP for Portsmouth South. Of course, his neighbour is Penny Mordaunt, she of the sword. The reason I say to my left and right is because I expect you all to watch this on Global Player, and if you're not watching it on Global Player, I'd love to know why not. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You might want to ask about the housing announcements today from both main parties. You might want to ask about the fact that major car manufacturers say that they may close their UK factories unless the Brexit deal is renegotiated with Brussels. And Jeremy Hunt says working in an office rather than at home should be the default, as Elon Musk says home working is morally wrong. Well, if Elon Musk says it's morally wrong, I probably think it's morally right. There we go. Just my point of view. We'll hear not from me over the course of the next hour. We'll hear from our panel. 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Alex in Camden. Alex, hello. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. With Labour talking tough on housing and the Conservatives reforming renting, will housing be the issue that swings the next general election?
Well, regular listeners to this programme will know that I've said over the past, 6 months, a year, that I think the political party that gets its housing policy right would stand a much better chance of winning the election than the other main party. So we've had announcements on renting, on house building today from both of the main parties. Stephen Morgan from Labour, let's start with you. Do you see housing as an absolutely key issue?
It's a huge issue, Ian. I think we've got a housing crisis in our country, and the only way out of that crisis is to build more homes. Obviously, there's been a number of announcements today, as you said. The rental reform is well overdue, and I rent myself. I've rented for 20 years. I think some of the measures the government are bringing forward are useful, but we set out a bigger plan to support renters with our Renters Charter. On house building...
How does that, just before we go on, how does that differ from what the Conservatives are planning?
So we've said a number of things. We want to make sure that tenants are able to make adaptations to their properties, are able to have pets, are able to have speedier repair work done as well. So better protections for tenants, I think, is absolutely vital. Like, certainly someone that's rented myself, the uncertainty that you have that your landlord might kick you out fairly quickly is quite unsettling for people, and that's why I think our policies are really clear. And on housing specifically, Keir's set out today that we're going to be the party that supports businesses and builders and not blockers. We need to make sure we have housing across our country. It's a neat phrase,
but what does it actually mean? Does it mean that you're going to support every building application that comes into local councils?
We want to give control to communities. We want to give control to local authorities. What we see at the moment is that communities get involved in planning issues far too late in the day, and we want to make sure that communities work with local councils to bring about housing targets.
But communities generally try and block new housing developments.
Not necessarily, but if they don't have information to hand, then I think that could be really difficult. In my own area in Portsmouth, 2,000 people on the waiting list. The government target was for 17,500 homes. We've got to build the houses we need for the country, and that means looking across the country about where they should be built.
OK, Gina Miller.
I think housing is vitally important as we go forward. I mean, we have been in crisis, and we've had promises from government after government. I think this announcement today, the Renters Reform Bill, is long overdue. There are, I think, some loopholes probably still there, because while it says that, the Section 21 no fault conviction will go, if you put up rentals by, say, 20%, you have in effect outed somebody. It also hasn't closed some of the loopholes on, saying that a property will be for a family member or to go to sale. So there's still some work to be done, I think, in that bill. But overall, I'm actually incredibly concerned and alarmed by what Labour said today about building on green belt. against a backdrop of warnings we've got about 1.5 limit being breached, and the fact that we have so much brown sites available, brown first before green, but also the fact that we're not really looking at things like the poor regulations when it comes to building. Against, again, the backdrop of the climate crisis that we've got, we really need to bolster our building regulations and look at brownfield sites much earlier. But in Epsom and Ewell, where I am, one of the things I'm concerned about also is when you look at the local plan, it's based on very old data. It's not based on the most recent census. It actually hasn't involved environmental scientists to say what will happen when you build in certain areas. So the plans that are being put forward just don't look robust enough.
But there are areas of Greenbelt that could be built on without anybody really sort of noticing. And where I live in Kent, my property is classed as Greenbelt. But if you looked at it, you wouldn't class it as Greenbelt because it doesn't look anything like you imagine a Greenbelt place should be. You've got a housing estate on one side, an old people's home on the other, and a couple of fields in between.
But looking at a site doesn't tell you its environmental value. So it's about much more than the building site itself.
You can make an argument that every site has environmental value.
Not if it's classed as green, and that's what we have to do, is we have to actually look at what are the qualifications.
Coming across as a bit NIMBY-ish, if I might say so.
No, I'm actually just very worried about what happens to our environment.
Because you're going to fight a general election in a seat which has lots of people who would be NIMBYs, aren't you?
No, I'm fighting a seat where it's really important that we have more housing, but we have to do it in a responsible way, that once we've actually taken a green site and made it a building site, you can't reclaim it. And that's a problem. You can't say, oh, that was a mistake and go back.
But Keir Starmer's not saying we're going to build on every Greenbelt site. He's come up with examples of car parks that are in a Greenbelt. Well, no, I don't care. I haven't seen a single car park in this country that I would describe as beautiful.
Exactly.
No, but we have to look at the detail. But so far, he's saying Greenbelt. That doesn't tell us enough of the detail. I'm sure we will see when the manifesto comes out what that is. It's just alarming that that's the first thing he thought of, rather than saying we actually need better regulations and we actually need to have a register of bad landlords, that we actually need to have a shorter period when it comes to repairs. There are other things you would have gone for rather than building on green.
I'd rather have a register of good landlords so people can aspire to get on it and be recommended.
Actually, that's a good idea.
But there we are. You can have that one for free, either party. Richard Holden.
Well, I suppose, look, I just, first of all, as somebody, similar to Stephen actually, I rented until literally a couple of years ago when I bought my first home in my constituency in northwest Durham. I don't think there'd have been any chance of me being able to buy a property in London ever. And so, I rented all the way from, being late teens all the way through to my mid-30s. So, and I had some good landlords and I had some bad landlords. And I'm glad that when you're getting to sort of banning no-fault evictions, I think that's a sensible thing to do, particularly with the increasing number of families renting, with all schools and all of that can entail. I think on the flip side, as a constituency MP, the biggest thing I get at the moment is, aside from usually social landlords not doing rents, not doing repairs quickly enough, and then when we do get in touch, they actually do them. They're pretty good. Is around antisocial behaviour from some tenants in some areas, and them not just annoying the landlord or destroying their property, but also causing absolute havoc in a local area. So I think that balance of having something which tackles those antisocial people, but at the same time, which has been difficult to do in the past if they're paying their rent on time and doing other things, but at the same time enables you to also deal with the no-fault evictions, I think is a good step in the right direction.
And is that in Labour's plans as well?
Yes.
It is. So there's a bit of consensus here, actually.
I'm sure. Well, I'm sure that sensible people would probably agree on sensible things.
Yeah.
Well, let's break the consensus. Why is it that Michael Gove abolished these housing targets for local authorities? To me, that seemed madness.
I think trying to force on local authorities specific numbers is difficult. Some areas can take more housing than others. I'd just say for my own constituency, for example, I've got a ex-steelworks site, 700 acres, which is is still only around a third built on, even though the steelwork site was got rid of in 1980. So there's potential for development there. It needs to be done in a sensible, staged way in which local services come. But I don't think anybody's up in arms about sensible development there. They don't want certain things like a proposal for an incinerator and that sort of thing, but they're not against sensible housing development, sensible industrial development on that site. So actually for that area in the south of Consett, you could see actually more housing being built than you would have a target for. But there are certain areas where you could easily say we could do more in this space, especially if the infrastructure came with it. Certain areas not. So it is a bit horses for courses. But I think what struck me in the last few days is that I was going around the country helping out colleagues with the local election campaign, and I got all this Labour literature saying Tories want to build over your greenfields, and then a couple of weeks later, Keir's saying, well, actually, we want to build all over the greenfields. Now, I don't have people can change their mind. Keir seems to do it quite a lot at the moment, but I'd really like to see some detail for what Labour are actually proposing, because it's all very well talking about an easy thing like a car park. I get, as a minister, requesting from TfL to do bits of changes to their property portfolio all the time, and I have to legally sign them off, which I'm always happy to do. But I want to see what they're actually really planning to do, because the devil's going to be in the detail on that.
So there's a lot of public sector land out there which could be used for house building. I mean, we had a caller a few minutes ago giving us a statistic which I still find difficult to believe. He was adamant that it was true, that 2% of Britain's landmass is populated by golf courses. And he was saying, well, if you just sort of requisition a few of those like the government had done with HS2, that will solve the whole problem. I'm not quite sure it's as simple as that.
No, I'm not. And 2% sounds quite high.
Well, he gave all the calculations.
I would just say, in terms of we do need to be careful. The detail needs to be produced. I'm interestingly, what I'd say is that, look, Sadiq also came in London and said, look, I'm going to do better than the previous, Boris had done when he was mayor. Actually, the house building, the starts and the completions were highest in 2015, 2016. So, I think I'm a bit sceptical of Labour promises around house building targets on that basis.
Kate Mansey.
I always think those house building targets or any targets are slightly dangerous anyway, and I have some sympathy for people who are often dismissed as NIMBYs, to be honest, because you think actually these are voters with legitimate concerns about where they live, the area in which they live, and I think it's too easy to dismiss them.
They tend to be people that have moved to that area and then want to pull up the drawbridge so nobody else can.
Not always. I think it's about having somewhere nice to live, and that doesn't necessarily mean out in the countryside. I think these rental reforms are really interesting as well, because there's been for ages this idea that the Englishman's home is his castle, and that we must all strive for home ownership. But actually, if we have more sensible plans about how you can rent long term, and do so well, and have more regulation over rogue landlords and things like that, then people could raise families in the city more easily than having to kind of rush out to grab up bits of countryside. So I think it's good that we're looking at different ways rather than just, whacking up loads of cheap homes on greenfield sites.
Well, somebody is referring me to a Financial Times fact-check article which debunks this myth about golf courses. So
we were right to be sceptical.
I was. That's the problem, though. When someone rings in and they sound as if they know what they're talking about, and you think, well, I haven't got the facts at my fingertips, but there we go. Right, we're going to move on to some different subjects in a moment. If you'd like to ask a question to our panel, you know the number 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's Cross Question with Iain Dale at 8:15.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
We have with us Richard Holden, the Conservative Roads Minister, Stephen Morgan, Labour Shadow Schools Minister, Gina Miller, the leader of the True and Fair Party, and Kate Mansey, Assistant Editor and Royal Reporter at the Mail on Sunday. Gina, just before we go to our next question, the True and Fair Party, you formed it, about a year ago now?
Yep.
How's it doing?
Well, we've got 7 candidates so far. We stepped down 2 because of the boundary changes, because we would have split the vote in those 2 seats from our research. And then we've got another tranche to announce soon, and then our pre-election manifesto in July. So really hard at work.
A pre-election manifesto? So you'll have a pre-manifesto and then a real one?
Yeah. Well, no, we'll have a shorter one and then much more detailed.
Now, there's something that maybe Labour could adopt, Stephen. Have a pre-election manifesto.
We're setting out our policies every day.
To one degree or another. But these 7 candidates, are they all in Conservative-held seats?
Yes, they're all in Conservative seats. So we've got candidates standing against Esther McVeigh, myself against Chris Grayling. We've got candidates in Mid-Bedfordshire against whoever takes over Nadine Dorries. We're not sure who that is as yet.
How do you pick these seats?
So we've looked at the seats where Labour and Lib Dems, it's not their target seats, it's outside their targets, and where the incumbent hasn't really had an opposition. So, for example, Epsom Newell, where Mr Graham's been for 21 years, and seems to think that it's his given seat. So, and
he's not going to move to another one, is he?
No, but the locals are not particularly happy with...
You're not intending to fight in northwest Durham, we hope?
No.
Well, I mean, you'd have difficulty because my seat's being abolished. So
I was going to say, I think there are some seats and movements we'll know in July for definite. But yes.
So what do you do in that situation?
Well, that's a very good question. If there was a natural, if it was sort of like 20%, if it was like 80% of it was the same, then it'd be easy. But so what had happened in the original boundary proposals is that Bridget Phillipson got chopped up, and then the second iteration, the Boundary Commission preferred the Labour's proposal, which meant that I got chopped up. So half of my seat gets merged with my neighbour who was doing a German debate with me today, Liz Twist, so it goes into Blaydon, and then it's sort of sliced in 4 slices. Some of it goes to City of Durham, some of it goes to Bishop Auckland, some of it goes to North Durham. So where I live in my constituency at the moment is going to be 3 constituencies away from my current constituency office afterwards. So I'm displaced.
You're homeless.
I'm homeless. So I'm going to have to find somewhere else.
So that means you can...
Maybe another seat.
Well, would you be obliged to stay in that area, or could you apply for anything?
I can go. Well, we'll have to see what happens. But I might go somewhere else. I think there's other people. There's because the North East loses 2 seats overall. There's not an awful lot of options.
I sense a fly on the wall documentary coming on this sort of the trials of Richard Holden.
Well, I mean, it might be quite interesting that.
Right,
over the next few months.
Let's move on. Let's go to a text question from Will in Crediton, who says, does the panel agree that the failing Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey should be dismissed following further floundering over inflation? I understood why he was kept on initially, to avoid further destabilisation of the markets, but surely now is the time he left. Gina Miller, your background is in the city. Let's come to you first.
Simply, Andrew Bailey should never have been appointed to that job at the Bank of England. It was a political appointment. I tried to stop it at the time and have it reviewed because we produced a report called Asleep at the Wheel, and that's what he was throughout his tenureship at the FCA, and it's what he's doing again at the Bank of England. He's always acts after the horse has bolted. He's not the right person, but unfortunately he's there for 8 years, and I do think the Treasury have to look at this again, because he doesn't have the qualities to be the governor of the Bank of England as we go towards some really strong headwinds financially and economically.
Why was he appointed in the first place then?
Exactly. That's the question. There were 4 candidates. He was definitely not the strongest. It was political.
But political in what way? Because I can't.
He was a Brexiteer.
Was he?
Yes, absolutely.
It's slightly going up in my opinion now, but...
No, he won't. It was about deregulation. It was definitely a political move.
OK. Stephen?
I don't think it's for me to get drawn into that, but I think the British public know what the government have done to this economy, and crashing the economy last year, as they did with that kamikaze budget, has had real consequences for people up and down this country. And I think that consequences of that we saw in the local elections recently.
But the remit of the Governor of the Bank of England is to keep inflation to 2%. Now, I completely accept that in many other countries inflation has gone up a huge amount too, but it does seem to be coming down rather more quickly in other countries than it is here. Surely, if you fail in your main task, you lose your job.
Well, there's mechanisms in place to hold him to account already, and I think that those mechanisms are working.
Okay. We're not going to get you to say it should all be brought back to the Treasury, are we?
Well,
you'd have Gordon Brown on the phone. Kate Mansey.
You do wonder what's going on there. I'd love to be kind of get in there and find out what truly is going on at the Bank of England, because we've seen so many kind of headlines, haven't we, back and forth, and various seems to be mismanagement. I'm always cautious about calling for someone to go, because I think particularly the markets do quiver, and whether now's the right time for that to happen, I don't know, but certainly there does need to be change at the Bank of England, and sometime soon, I'd say.
Richard Holden, we know as a government minister you can't call for the Bank of England governor to go, but do you...
That might cause problems.
I think it might. Do you have concerns over the future of monetary policy?
Look, I think the government's got a very clear strategy on inflation, and the Bank of England and the government need to work hand in hand as close as they possibly can on that. I've been doing my bit today with keeping bus fares down, get around for £2.
Richard, tell us all about your big announcement today. I saw you on my screen earlier, standing at the dispatch box, looking a little lonely, if I may say so.
We had lots of support today, and lots of questions on it. Basically, we started this year with a 3-month pilot of freezing bus fares £2 right across the country, so lowering the £2 and freezing them outside London. And we continued that for another 3 months, and then today we've announced we're continuing it all the way to the 31st of October, and we're going to have another £2.50 freeze of bus fares all the way through to November next year. So it's one of those things that I know a lot of my constituents use bus. We don't have any train in my constituency at all. For a lot of my working constituents and low-paid jobs use bus. A lot of my college students have to use them to get to college as well. I think it's a cost of living thing for me, and something which I'm really hope is going to help a lot of people across the country. So that's been our big announcement today. Get around for £2, and also on the flip side, giving some more
around in a pub for £2. You'll be doing well.
Come up to my Wetherspoons in concert, and you can get a pint for £2 still up there, which is quite astonishing when you go to anywhere in London.
If anybody is listening to this programme from CCHQ today, I think they should clip that answer as a model answer for any minister that is asked a difficult question and how to get out of it. And I think that was very well done, if I may say so. Will, thank you very much for that question. Mark is in Hitchin. Hello, Mark.
Yeah, hello and good evening, everybody. This afternoon, Andrea Jenkins issued a letter that she sent to the Prime Minister where she claims that many millions in our nations voted to end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. As that never formed part of the 2016 referendum or is included anywhere in the 2019 Tory manifesto, do the panel agree with that statement that we voted for it, but I don't know when? Or is it simply a case that Andrea is being influenced by her own biases?
I think everyone's influenced by their own biases, aren't they? But apparently Andrea Jenkins tweeted this afternoon that she'd written a letter to Rishi Sunak calling on him to withdraw Britain from the European Court of Human Rights, saying that people, quotes, voted to end the jurisdiction of this foreign court. When did that happen, Richard?
So on that, the Rishi's there has been an issue around this Article 39, which is these very last-minute blocks on things like deportations of foreign criminals and elements like that. Rishi's been speaking to, and the ECHR comes from the Council of Europe, which is something we set up.
Nothing to do with the European Union.
Nothing to do with the European Union. It's totally separate. And in fact, I don't know if Stephen was, but I was a member of the Council of Europe as an MP for a while, and it was actually quite effective in the early days of the Ukraine conflict. We kicked out Russia, which Belarus was already out. So it's been quite helpful in certain things about pulling together and where Britain can lead as well in a broader context. No, I don't think that's what we should do. I think we should be able to with proper changes to Article 39. I think, and the fact that we've now got our own judges able to interpret it, and we're giving them a much stronger steer in terms of the fact that they can derogate from the decisions of the European Court when they want to, and when they think that British law, not to kowtow to European rules, but instead, I trust British judges basically to make the decisions, and they can interpret the law as they see fit. And so I don't think it's necessary basically to leave the ECHR. I think our judges are more than capable of making the right decisions when they are basically.
But when Andrea Jenkins says people voted to end the jurisdiction of this foreign court, she's wrong, isn't she?
Technically, yes.
Gina.
She's wrong. It wasn't, as your caller says, as Mark says. Sorry, it was not. It was nowhere. But this is just desperation. There's an awful lot of this that's coming out at the moment, trying to rewrite history and rewrite what was voted for and what was not. I think it's really a waste of time and effort. We've got so many other things we should be worrying about. The news today of, one of the biggest car manufacturers pulling out because of the rule of origin rules, which means that they could pay 10% more tariffs on cars, and saying that, we need to reform our relationship with the EU. That's actually much more of a focus than talking about the ECHR. It's really, we've got to focus our energy. We've got a trade and cooperation agreement which is damaging our trade, and there's an opportunity in January 2025 to actually look again. All the tools to renegotiate are in that TCA. That's where the focus should be.
Let me play devil's advocate here, because as Richard says, we have some of the finest judges in the world. We have a lot of other countries look to our legal system as well. And yet you look at the makeup of the European Court of Human Rights, where a lot of their judges aren't even professional lawyers. Why would we want to continue ceding sovereignty to a court that isn't even really a professional court?
It's more advisory than anything. And actually, we lost a seat. One of our stellar advocates was there, Eleanor Sharpston, and is no longer there. But we signed up to this. And what was really interesting to me when Rishi Sunak was talking the other day in Iceland is that everybody else was talking about Ukraine. He was the only person mentioning Article 39. Every other country member representative was talking about Ukraine. I think the focus here is on the wrong thing. It needs rejigging to some degree. We do not need to leave it, and It's not a huge problem.
Can I come to both of you very briefly on this, because we're running out of time? Kate first.
Yes, I would just agree. I mean, providing British judges are given that independence, I think that's where we need to be. With regards to rejigging, I think a decision was made. We need to move forwards. I don't think we need to be looking back and analysing and going back and forth. I think that decision, the referendum, needs to be respected.
Stephen?
I agree with what everyone said on the panel so far. I think it's a distraction from the real issues that our country's facing right now. OK, we'll come on to some more real issues in a moment. It's 8:30. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
New York police officials say a car chase of Prince Harry and Meghan by paparazzi last night was not, as they describe, a near catastrophe, but was a chaotic scene. The couple claimed to have been pursued for more than 2 hours after leaving an awards ceremony. The Armed Forces Minister says the UK should be considering what its support for Ukraine looks like over the next few years. James Heapy has told LBC Kyiv will eventually win the war, but it won't happen on the back of this summer's counter-offensive. And England international and Premier League star Ivan Toney's been banned from football for 8 months. The Brentford striker's punishment is for breaking betting rules. LBC weather: showers in the south will clear to leave a largely dry night for much of the UK. Cloudy for Scotland with patchy light rain and lows of 5 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Richard Holden is here. He's the man who's cut your bus fares today. That's what he'd like to be known as, isn't it?
Oh, definitely, yeah, please.
Gina Miller, what would you like to be known as?
True fairness first.
True and fairness first. I thought you were going to say the slayer of Chris Grayling.
Oh, well,
Kate
no,
Mansey
that's not
is
yet.
assistant editor and royal reporter at the Mail on Sunday, and Stephen Morgan wishes to be the schools minister. He's now the shadow schools minister and MP for Portsmouth South. Have you had a conversation with Penny Mordaunt about the coronation?
I have, the day after the coronation, and she said her arms were hurting a little.
Yeah, I think
but she did our city proud.
Probably an understatement. Right, let's move on to a text question from Archie in Inverness. When it comes to high-speed car chases in New York, should we let our respective confirmation biases run riot, or should we wait for the factual evidence, i.e. CCTV footage, eyewitness accounts, etc., to emerge? Stephen?
I think Richard agreed with me that it's not appropriate for politicians to talk about the rules, and we don't expect the rules to talk about politics. But what I will say is journalists should hold themselves high in their values and their ethics. And I'll probably leave it at that, Iain, to be honest. I don't want to get drawn into it.
OK, Gina?
I think you wait for the evidence. It doesn't matter if it's
this is going to be a very brief round.
Case, or when we see somebody is beaten up in whatever, or there's an incident, you have to wait for the evidence.
But it's already becoming quite clear, isn't it, that people who are fans of Harry and Meghan say this is outrageous behaviour by the paparazzi, and people who aren't don't believe it.
I think, unfortunately, there's already a divide when it comes to them. And, supporters will be supporters and others can't be swayed. And it's very difficult to dislodge that sort of bias, I think. But, I think the sensible thing to do is to wait and see the evidence.
Richard?
I think we need to be very careful about our own biases in all sorts of things that we do in life. But more broadly, and given this is about the royal family, and it's pretty inappropriate for a government minister.
I don't know, Bank of England, royal family. I wonder what next question will be that none of you can answer. Kate Mansey.
Probably similar answer, I think. New York, wasn't it? I think up to the New York police.
Well, that is a very brief answer. Let's move on.
Not a question about the Church of England or something like that.
Well, we'll see what Ulf in Hamburg can come up with. Ulf, welcome to the programme again. I'm coming to visit you in Hamburg in a few weeks' time. What would you like to ask?
Okay, good Abend, Iain. Good evening, panel. It appears the UK will have to renegotiate its relationship with the EU in order to save its car manufacturing industry. What would the UK have to offer that would sweeten the deal for the EU, considering all those many manufacturing jobs that might go to the EU?
OK, Stephen Morgan.
So I think Ulf is referring to electric car issues that were of
I think
importance in
Vauxhall,
Parliament today.
I didn't actually realise that Vauxhall now owns Fiat.
So Stellantis,
Peugeot
which is a big car owner,
Citroën.
they own all these brands.
They are worried about that, but I think there are more issues at stake here rather than just electric cars.
I mean, just on electric cars, I think deeply worrying news, and I think the government should have seen this coming. Keir has clearly said that we need to make Brexit work and want to bring down some of the barriers that are existing for trade. But the government have got to take action here. We've got to protect British jobs. We've got to.
But what can we
markets.
offer the EU to encourage them to come to a deal on this?
Well, I think we've just got to negotiate, haven't we? We've got to sit down, get around the table and find something that works. We've got to invest in Britain. We've got to support research work. We're really clear that we want to invest in green jobs, and we've got an industrial strategy to make that happen. The government haven't got an industrial strategy, and I think that's why we're in some of the mess that we're in.
But if you were the leaders of France, Germany, Spain, Italy, all of whom have big car industries, wouldn't you be licking your lips and thinking, well, the Brits have made their bed, they can lie in it. There's nothing that they can give us that we would want to come to an agreement on this?
Well, I mean, that's a challenge we face out of the European Union, isn't it? But we've got to find a way to make this work that's good for our economy.
Well, many would say that what would be good for our economy would be to go back into the EU, and if Labour offered proper leadership, that's what Keir Starmer should stand up and say.
Well, I was a Remainer. I campaigned for a people's vote, but, we've moved on since then. We've got to make sure Brexit now works, and Keir set out his 5-point plan to make that happen.
OK. Kate?
Yeah, I think it's about promoting brand Britain, isn't it? And finding new and different ways to make those connections and make it beneficial for companies to be here, whether that's tax breaks or what, so that we can get jobs in, and just creating that sort of that environment where people want to come here and that we can get those jobs in rather than going back and negotiating backwards and forwards. It's like you say, it's already been done. So.
Gina?
It's not been done, and it's pie in the sky to think you can't. It's not about going back. It's about the reality. It's about the reality of what we're facing, and business sector after sector are suffering from lack of skilled workforce. They're suffering from barriers to trade. Bloomberg, all the experts, LSE, all of them are saying that we're in for a tough time. We actually haven't seen the worst yet, because there was a bit of a rolling back of the full implications when the pandemic was on. But, in business investment, it's down 19% compared to the G7 average. We're looking at...
what was it before Brexit?
Before Brexit, it was closer to 27. So we're down, already. And this is only the beginning.
Well, 19 down is better than 27 down.
No, from 27%. So we're down 19% from that.
Okay.
So also we've got, Bloomberg saying that we're looking at about a 100 million a year, $1 billion a year deficit going forwards when it comes to trade. When people talk about not going back, this is not about going back. This is about going forwards to a relationship where we reduce the damage, because we can't go back in. We have to find a better way of actually trading with the EU, and whilst we also do other trade deals around the world. But when you remember that the arch Brexiteers, the architects of Brexit, Mr Farage, Mr Hannand, Mr Frost, all wanted us to be members of the single market. They originally never said in any of this that we were supposed to leave the single market. And because everyone got caught up in this, including Boris, who said, the night after, what have we done? Because we got caught up in this, they went to a much more extreme Brexit without any plan, any real understanding of what the impact would be on sectors and industries. And we have got to be honest about this.
But answering Ulf's question here, what can we offer the EU to encourage them on this issue, on the Vauxhall issue, to come to a new agreement?
It's not about the EU. It's about us saying that we have to actually show the EU that we act in good faith, that we have a stable government, that we're not politicising everything, that we stand by the rule of law, both internationally and also from a moral point of view. It is showing that we are grown-ups. When we can prove that and we can act in good faith, we can get round the table and negotiate, because it's got to be a win-win for both sides. That's the whole point of negotiating.
Don't you think that Rishi Sunak he's got a very, very different approach to Liz Truss and Boris Johnson?
He has got a very different approach, but then it doesn't help today in some of the things he said in Japan. It doesn't help what his Home Secretary is saying.
He said in Japan?
That the Brexit benefits are, and then rolled out that the scrapping EU law was a way to show that Brexit was benefiting us. Well, there is no evidence of that.
Richard Holden.
Well, I'm just going to fundamentally disagree with a lot of what Gina's just said. And the idea that Britain doesn't stand by the rule of law or has shown that it doesn't is obviously nonsense. And
it does, but in a specific and limited way.
Well, I think if we look more broadly about what the biggest issue that's facing Europe at the moment and standing by the rule of law, it was Britain that led the way in response to the recent crisis in Ukraine. When the German government wanted to send helmets, we'd already been training Ukrainian soldiers for years and were stepping up with sending arms and leading the way. I say that's standing by the rule of law rather than trying to, as others initially did, try and weasel around and protect their own self-interest.
But on this specific issue.
So I think that's an important point to make there. The idea that Britain doesn't stand tall in the world, I think, is nonsense. And I think actually we led the way in Europe on that. So I think it's just a point worth making. On the broader point around rules of origin, I actually know quite a lot about this because I've got Nissan just down the road from my constituency, and it's one of the biggest employers of my constituents, and I did a lot of speaking to them when we were going through this at earlier stages. I don't know the specifics of what's being discussed around this specific car manufacturer at the moment. All I know is that Nissan were able to put £1 billion of investment into Sunderland tick all the boxes of this combination of UK and EU rules of origin. If there's something that needs to be done there, we put some government support into that as well at the time, around £100 million and for £1 billion investment, delivering high-skilled manufacturing jobs in the northeast of England for decades to come. I don't know the specifics of why this is the case here. So I'd be really interested to see it. And I know that Kemi has already said that she's looking at this in depth at the moment. But I think there are things that we can do differently outside the EU, which can benefit the country as well. You can look at the rules around Solvency II reform, which is being looked at the moment around what we can invest in as a country and what our financial services can invest in. Looking at some of the other deals we're able to do around the world, which we wouldn't have been able to do when we're in the EU as well, whether that's the Japanese trade deal or now looking towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Which is 0.1%. That's what's predicted to give our GDP. The CPTPP, of all the experts have said, it will contribute 0.1%.
But there are things we can do outside the EU that we couldn't have done inside the EU, and I'd be very interested to know the full details of this, because when I got stuck in with Nissan to help them out at that point, it turned out that actually the problems which they initially thought might be there were not as prominent as they were later, and in fact it led to a major investment into the Envision battery manufacturing plant just down the road from my constituency.
What's happened to that battery plant now?
I mean, it's operating fully, as far as I'm aware.
There was a battery plant there that went out of business, wasn't
there? There was a proposal for one north of Tyne. I mean, right. I know Gina probably, she doesn't probably know the northeast as well as I do, but there's one which is being looked at north of Tyne. But the one at Sunderland looks to be doing really well and has a massive potential for growth, and as well as we look at other things. And I just don't buy this sort of Britain can't operate outside of Europe. Britain doesn't lead in the world sort of rhetoric that Gina constantly pumps out.
No, I say it's a transition that we need and a proper plan. We don't have a transition plan.
No, I don't think that's true. And the way you talk about the country as some form of, state which doesn't back the rule of law, when people come in here internationally to use our legal system, which is, world renowned.
We keep threatening to break international law.
When we are the ones who stand up for international law in countries like Ukraine, it just gets really boring when you're constantly talking the country down.
Well, on that note, we're going to have a slightly awkward break, I think, in the studio. Let's 8:46.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The change in rental laws in the rental sector, more than 10 million renters no longer facing the threat of no-fault evictions. Spencer's in Chigwell.
My agency manages around about 600 properties. It's hopefully the speeding up of the antiquated and very slow possession process for when a tenant is routinely not paying rent.
Talia in Battersea.
It's going to ruin the rental sector completely. The Section 21 was introduced to be able to get landlords to be able to up rent or to change tenants, and this made it all landlord friendly. They're just going to get rid of it again and just cause havoc. Landlords are going to sell up.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Richard Holden, Stephen Morgan, Gina Miller and Kate Mansey here with us taking your calls and texts. Let's go to a text question from James in Hitchin. Brief questions are always the best, I find, and this is a really good one. Imagine it's your job to decide who gets to be a guest speaker at a university. How would you decide where to draw the line? Now, this is on the back of a group of Oxford academics writing a letter condemning the Oxford Students' Union for attempting to ostracise the Oxford Union for booking gender critic Kathleen Stock to speak there. We're going to be talking a lot more about this after 9 o'clock, and we'll be taking your calls on it too. Gina, let's start with you.
It's a tough one because I think you do have to respect freedom of speech, and especially in an academic setting where they should have robust debate. And actually, I was up at the Oxford Union last November, so I do know that they are very capable of having robust debate.
Let's turn them down.
But they definitely can hold their own. But there are bits about this story that don't seem right. But I think the principle of freedom of speech and actually extending your understanding and being able to question other people why they hold their vision and their views is very, very important.
And if you don't want to listen to somebody, don't go to the event. Yeah. It's as simple as that, surely.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't go, if you choose to be offended or not. So if you don't want that debate, that speaker, you just don't go.
It was interesting here. I gather that Oxford University or the Students' Union have offered counselling to anyone who might feel a bit upset by listening to Kathleen Stock's views. And yet 2 weeks ago, they held a debate on pornography and didn't offer any kind of support to anyone who might be affected by that. Kate?
I just think this strikes at the heart of everything that's wrong with some of the universities today. It's just this kind of woke madness that seems to have gripped the universities. University is supposed to be a place where you can explore lots of different issues. You can go, you can speak to like-minded people and people who are going to challenge your views. And here we've got this kind of pile-on of Kathleen Stock, who's not a hate monger by any stretch. It's ridiculous to say that she's even transphobic. She's voicing very sensible views in most part, and if you don't agree with them, it's not about cancelling them. It's about having these kind of debates and this sort of ivory tower mentality that they've become these kind of strange sections of society now that don't talk to the rest of society. I think it's really, really worrying, and I don't know how they got to that
you
stage.
only win an argument by having the argument.
Exactly.
That to me seems to be the crucial thing here. Stephen?
It's important you protect free speech. It's not uncommon for universities to have controversial speakers. It's not uncommon for universities to have protests about those speakers. But ultimately, it's the university's decision, I think, to make these decisions and for them to protect free speech. So let's trust universities to make decisions.
Is there not a new law that actually forces universities to stand up for freedom of speech?
I was on the bill committee.
Yeah.
Far away.
Yes.
No. So I just say, look, I think that there is a line where things cross into hate speech and incitement to violence, and that's where I would sort of draw the line on that. I think,
but maybe some trans campaigners might argue here.
I appreciate exactly what you're about to say, which is basically where does that hate speech thing come in? I think there are areas of legitimate public debate which are widely accepted on that. I did a panel not that long ago with Rod Liddle. I was on the other side of a debate to him at Durham University, and he'd had a really big issue not that long before on that, and I think that there is I think people know, I think there's a difference, there's a very clear difference between what is academic freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of challenge and other things which are clearly there to incite hatred. I think that difference is very clear. I don't think universities should be cancelling people, and I don't think that student unions should be either, when universities are meant to be places where people's ideas are challenged in a broad context. And I think there's an easy reasonableness argument on a lot of this. I was particularly taken aback when I was there, because I met some of the students who were at Durham who'd been, and this was a couple of years ago. Things seem to have changed a bit more recently, but they were saying on one side they wouldn't get their essays accepted if they didn't have, put their preferred pronouns on some of their essays, which just seems silly to me. And on the other side, they were being advertised sex worker classes by the Students' Union, who were in this sort of really weird place. And I think what we've got to do is just take a little bit of a step back. I think academic environment can get very bizarre.
We didn't have those at the University of East Anglia in 1984. But I remember inviting Cecil Parkinson to speak at UEA in 1984. 900 students came to see him. It was a very left-wing university at the time. And we got egged.
Yeah.
Only time in my life have any of you been egged before? You don't actually know it's happened until you see the stuff running down your jacket. In fact, they all hit me and Cecil Parkinson's wife. None of them actually hit him. Anyway, I digress. James, thank you very much. Good question. Tracy in Scarborough says, is the world united enough to keep 1.5 alive? This is on the back of researchers saying there's now a 66% chance that we'll pass the 1.5 degrees global warming threshold between now and 2027. Stephen Morgan.
I think this is a wake-up call for us. It requires urgent action, the climate emergency, and I think any government that doesn't take swift, robust action will face the consequences. You will see that in my constituency, a flat constituency. We will see rising sea levels. It will flood my constituency, and that's why Labour's got a plan to take these issues really seriously.
But it doesn't really matter what we do, does it? Well, of course it does to an extent, but it's what countries who are polluting the atmosphere like nobody else, like China and India, to name but two.
The scale of the challenge is so great, it's all of our responsibility.
Well, of course it is, but do you not think that these warnings need to be heeded in Beijing and in Delhi rather than necessarily just in the West?
It's a responsibility for every country, and I think Britain's got a leading role to play, and let's seize that opportunity.
OK, Kate?
Well, I agree with you, Ian. I think it does rely on China and India and those countries as well, and America. I don't think Liz Truss's little mission is very helpful when it comes to these sorts of bigger issues where we do have to have a kind of global union or global attitude to how we're going to solve it.
Gina?
Oh, we do need a mass mobilisation of governments around the globe. This is not going to be down to one country or the other, because actually there was a report in April about the temperature in seas and oceans, which is just as alarming as a report today. The good news is that we still have time, because this is 2027 they're talking about in the report today, but it can only be done on a global stage. And it now has to be, I think we have to have a global emergency summit. But when these summits happen, and they agree things, I was just going to say, when they happen, it's then the watering down of the promises that have been made that has got to stop, because that's what tends to happen. Governments drag their feet and we get watering down of commitments that are made. And I think these reports from scientists, I have to say, one of the things in the report today, which I found, actually, and the one in April as well, is the scientists said that they couldn't fully understand why. So if the scientists don't know, in a way, what is it that we have to do? So I think there is quite a lot of work to be done.
Richard?
I think we made I think this is one of the areas where Britain's actually been pretty leading in terms of legislating for net zero. We've seen our CO2 emissions drop to levels we've not seen since the early Victorian period. I think there's actually an opportunity here for Britain. I can see it in the northeast, whether it's the net zero and the battery manufacturing plants up at Sunderland, or you go down to Teesside and see the huge investments going in there in terms of offshore wind, and down in the Humber estuary as well. I think we've seen an absolute seismic change in the last decade here in the UK about how we deal with this situation, switching away from coal, and I think it's also about energy security as well for the UK. There's multiple ways of looking at this, and I think they're all positive, and they all lead to high-skilled UK manufacturing jobs, which is what my constituents are interested in more than anything else. They want good opportunities for themselves and their kids, and if we can do that at the same time as becoming more energy secure and also removing carbon dioxide and other particulates from the atmosphere, I think that's all to the good.
Now, very brief answers to our final question from Callum in Birmingham. I suspect I know what several of your answers are going to be on this. A new Legend of Zelda video game, yep, me neither, has sold more than 10 million copies in just 3 days. Are you a gamer? And if so, do you have a favourite, Kate Mansey?
I'm so sick of these games. I've got 2 little kids. I can't rip them away from Minecraft.
And you must have given them to play with.
I know, because I wanted them to shut up, and then it worked too well, and now I can't get them off them. But
you're an unfit mother. That's what you're saying.
I know, it's dreadful. when they're not playing it, what they like to do is go on YouTube and watch other videos of people play. I just don't get it. I don't understand the attraction. I don't understand the appeal. I realise it's a deeply unpopular view, but
I'm so glad you said that, because you must be about half my age, and it makes me feel that I shouldn't feel guilty about it. Stephen?
I'm not a gamer, but growing up in the 1990s, I quite enjoyed playing on my Game Boy and playing Tetris, but the music was always quite annoying.
OK, I just remember Pac-Man. Gina?
No, I've definitely never played a game. The only thing I was saying earlier I've done is a Tamagotchi, and I think I killed my pet in a day. So, I'm definitely not a gamer. But I think the one thing that is very worrying is the addictive nature of some of these games and the amount of time that kids are on it. We have got to look at that.
Richard?
Well, I'm going to break with the rest of the panel slightly here. As a teenage boy, I quite like. You probably don't know these games. I used to play a game called Command and Conquer, Red Alert, and things like that. Civilization.
Was it a bit like Risk?
SimCity, all that sort of thing. I quite like strategy, build your own sort of city sort of games. I loved that when I was a kid. I must say, this probably ages me a lot. I've never really heard of The Legend of Zelda. I'm sure it's excellent, and I'm sure people are really going to enjoy doing it. But I would agree with Kate on this. I really get to the point where if I would be literally going to watch somebody else play a computer game, I think that's too far.
I think it's very kind of you to give Kate a splash for the Mail on Sunday about you and Sin City.
Sin City, not Sin City.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank goodness for that. Right. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming on the show tonight. I think we've had a really good run of Cross Question this week. We'll be back with another one on Monday. But first, we are going to go back to one of the questions in the last hour. Free speech in peril as trans row engulfs Oxford University. Oxford Dons have warned students that freedom of speech is at risk as a trans row engulfs the university. Where do you draw the limits of who you invite to speak at a university? I've interviewed Kathleen Stock, the woman in question here, the Oxford Students' Union seemed to object to. I can't see that she could be described as a hate figure or a preacher of hate in any stretch or imagination. But I wonder where you would draw the limits. What have been your experiences as a student, maybe attending some of these events, or you've had your event cancelled? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Prince Harry and Meghan's claim of a near catastrophic car chase through New York has been played down slightly.